John Gotti's story is the tale of a man who went from the crowded tenements of the Bronx to the glossy covers of national magazines, from the back rooms of neighborhood bars to the very center of the American underworld. For years, he embodied everything both terrifying and strangely alluring about organized crime. To his supporters, he was the ultimate underdog who beat the system, while to law enforcement, he was a ruthless predator hiding behind sharp suits and slick smiles. His rise and fall is one of the most dramatic sagas in the history of the American Mafia. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born on October 27, 1940, into a family that knew more about struggle than comfort. His father worked odd jobs, barely managing to provide for 13 children. The young Gotti grew up in a world where survival meant toughness, and toughness often meant trouble. By the time he was 12 years old, he was already running errands for local gangs, carrying messages, acting as a lookout, and learning the rhythms of the street. Teachers noticed his intelligence, but also his defiance and short temper. At just 16, he dropped out of school, convinced that education could never bring him the respect or wealth he craved. Power was not in books or classrooms. It was out there on the streets, worn like a badge by men who drove big cars and wore expensive suits. In the 1950s, New York was ruled by the five families of the Mafia: the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno families controlled gambling, loan sharking, extortion, and unions. To young men like Gotti, these bosses weren't faceless criminals. They were heroes, figures of success who commanded fear and admiration in equal measure. Gotti gravitated to the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in Ozone Park, Queens, run by the Fatico brothers, who were Gambino associates. Here he learned how real business was done in the underworld. He mastered the craft of loan sharking, bookmaking, and running numbers. But what truly set him apart was his charisma. Gotti had a way of commanding attention, making people believe in him, and inspiring loyalty. It wasn't long before he showed his willingness to enforce the code of the streets with violence. In 1973, he took part in the murder of James McBratney, who had kidnapped and killed a nephew of Carlo Gambino, the head of the family. Gotti and two others cornered McBratney in a Staten Island bar and shot him dead. Although he was arrested, Gotti managed to secure a plea bargain for attempted manslaughter and served only a few years in prison. This episode cemented his reputation as someone who could be trusted to do what had to be done, but also as someone smart enough to work the system to his advantage. By the late 1970s, Gotti had climbed steadily through the Gambino ranks. When Paul Castellano inherited the family after Carlo Gambino's death, many capos were discontent. Castellano was wealthy, aloof, and more interested in white-collar crime than the street-level operations that made soldiers rich. Gotti, who embodied the street gangster's image, saw Castellano as weak and out of touch. Still, he waited for the right moment. Running the Bergen crew, he expanded his operations, recruited loyal soldiers, and built an image not just as a mobster, but as a man of the people. Unlike Castellano, Gotti was approachable. He tipped generously, sponsored neighborhood events, and wore his wealth proudly. In Queens, he became something of a local celebrity, admired even by those who knew his money came from crime. By 1985, tensions between Castellano and Gotti were boiling over. Castellano had forbidden drug dealing, but many crews, including Gotti's, were making fortunes in narcotics. Fear grew that Castellano would eventually have Gotti killed for defying orders. Gotti chose not to wait. On December 16, 1985, Castellano and his bodyguard arrived at Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan. As Christmas shoppers bustled on the sidewalks, gunmen loyal to Gotti struck, shooting Castellano dead in broad daylight. It was one of the most audacious mob hits in American history, carried out in front of witnesses and flashing holiday lights. Within days, Gotti took control of the Gambino family, his rise sealed not by quiet backroom politics, but by an act of public violence that shocked the nation. As boss, Gotti cultivated an image unlike any mobster before him. He was flamboyant, charming, and seemingly untouchable. He drove flashy cars, wore custom-made Brioni suits, and walked into courtrooms as if he owned them. Reporters swarmed him, and Gotti never shied away from their cameras. He smiled, waved, and gave quotes, while juries mysteriously failed to convict him again and again. Witnesses changed their stories. Jurors were tampered with. Evidence seemed to vanish. Time after time, prosecutors watched as Gotti walked free. The media dubbed him the Teflon Don because nothing seemed to stick. For the public, he became a strange anti-hero, the gangster who could beat the system, the man who lived by his own rules. But behind the glossy image, the walls were closing in. The FBI and federal prosecutors were more determined than ever to bring him down. They tapped phones, bugged rooms, and built their case slowly. The turning point came not just from technology, but from betrayal. Gotti's underboss, Sammy the Bull Gravano, had been his most loyal lieutenant, helping him secure power after Castellano's murder. But facing life in prison, Gravano did the unthinkable. He broke the Mafia's sacred code of silence and became a government witness. His testimony, combined with hours of secretly recorded conversations, gave prosecutors the evidence they needed. In April 1992, after a long and highly publicized trial, Gotti was found guilty of racketeering, conspiracy, and multiple murders. The once untouchable Don, who had laughed off so many indictments, now faced the reality of life in prison with no chance of parole. On June 23, 1992, he was sentenced to life behind bars. The streets of New York buzzed with mixed emotions. Some cheered justice, while others mourned the fall of a man they had admired as a symbol of defiance. In prison, Gotti's world shrank. The man who once commanded armies of loyal men was locked in near total isolation. At Marion Federal Penitentiary, he spent 23 hours a day in his cell. Though he tried to maintain influence from behind bars, the mafia outside was changing. Younger, more ruthless groups rose to power, and the traditional mafia lost much of its dominance. For Gotti, the years dragged on, and his health deteriorated. By the late 1990s, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died in a federal prison hospital in Springfield, Missouri, at the age of 61. Even in death, his story remained larger than life. His funeral in Queens drew crowds, though federal restrictions prevented the grand displays of old mafia send-offs. For some, his death marked the end of an era. For others, it was simply justice finally served. But John Gotti's legacy was far more complicated. He was a man who turned the mafia boss into a celebrity, who embraced cameras instead of hiding from them, and who showed both the allure and the cost of life in organized crime. He was ruthless enough to order killings without hesitation, yet charismatic enough to inspire loyalty among ordinary people who saw him as a Robin Hood figure. He weakened the mafia by attracting too much attention, yet he also redefined what it meant to be a mob boss. John Gotti's story is not just about crime, but about power, image, and the thin line between fear and admiration. He showed how far someone could rise on loyalty, intimidation, and charisma, and how quickly it could all collapse when betrayal entered the picture. His reign as the Teflon Don was built on myth, but in the end, even myths can fall. John Gotti built his empire on fear, loyalty, and a flair for the dramatic. But in the end, betrayal and hubris brought him down. His story forces us to ask, when power is built on intimidation and glamour, is it really strength or just an illusion waiting to collapse? Was Gotti a hero of the streets or simply a ruthless criminal who paid the ultimate price?